Alright, hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf, impromptu reading, Alfred North Whitehead's The Concept of Nature, Chapter 2. I did not read Chapter 1, Theories of Bifurcation of Nature, just because this is actually one of the famous chapters, kind of like how Deleuze's chapter on the image of thought allows you to see certain important framings of the rest of his philosophy. This chapter is last I knew when I met a Whiteheadian who isn't really a Whiteheadian. I mean, he wasn't really committed to it. The guy was like 17 or 16 at the time. He lied to us. He said he was like 19. But, I'm terrible with like judging my ages and online people. I'm like, you're 19, you have a high-pitched voice. I mean, sure, I can believe it. And I mean, usual 16, 17-year-old is not talking about some deep shit. He had a blog on Whitehead, and he made a blog on this, and I read it, and I remember hating it. But I never actually read any of the original stuff. So let's see if we have a better judgment by reading this original. We will definitely not finish, but let's see if we find anything useful. So beginning. In my previous lecture, I criticized the concept of matter as a substance whose attributes we perceive. This way of thinking of matter is, I think, the historical reason for its introduction into science, and is still the vague view of it at the background of our thoughts which makes the current scientific doctrine appear so obvious. Namely, we conceive ourselves as perceiving attributes of things, and bits of matter are the things whose attributes we perceive. In the 17th century, the sweet simplicity of this aspect of matter received a rude shock. The transmission doctrines of science were then in process of elaboration, and by the end of the century were unquestioned, though their particular forms have since been modified. The establishment of these transmission theories marks a turning point in the relation between science and philosophy. The doctrines to which I am especially alluding are the theories of light and sound. I have no doubt that the theories have been vaguely floating about before as obvious suggestions of common sense, for nothing in thought is ever completely new. But at that epoch they were systematized and made exact, and their complete consequences were ruthlessly deduced. It is the establishment of this procedure of taking the consequences seriously which marks the real discovery of a theory. Systematic doctrines of light and sound as being something proceeding from the emitting bodies were definitely established, and in particular the connection of light with color was laid bare by Newton. And more so by Goethe, but you're not taught that in school. By the way, that's the one thing that I come to some agreement with Schopenhauer on that I've ever read. He has a short essay critiquing and comparing and unifying Goethe's theory of color and Newton's theory of color, and saying they're actually two sides of one thing, where Newton is the purely physical, Goethe is the side of the mental, and that color is a dual determination, which is not merely physical, not merely mental. So that for him, the full theory of color is a theory of the perception of color and the mechanism of the transmission and of color.
I want to note that from the looks of it, it seems like he's going to, instead of saying that matter is emitted, or light and sound are emitted from matter, he's going to say that light and sound compose matter. I'm curious where he's going to take this.
Can't say I know where he's going. He's got a funky way of viewing things.
Yeah. He's establishing what he thinks is the main scientific paradigm. And I assume he's going to flip it.
Yeah,
or critique it.
So the result completely destroyed the simplicity of the substance and attribute theory of perception. What we see depends on the light entering the eye. Furthermore, we do not even perceive what enters the eye. The things transmitted are waves, or as Newton thought, minute particles, and the things seen are colors. Locke met this difficulty by a theory of primary and secondary qualities, namely there are some attributes of the matter which we do perceive. These are the primary qualities, and there are other things which we perceive, such as colors, which are not attributes of matter, but are perceived by us as if they were such attributes. These are the secondary qualities of matter. So, I mean, yeah, sure. An analytically anal kind of argument that
Right.
technically is correct. They're like, well, once you have that and like light is some kind of particle or wave, well, it's not like I'm actually seeing the thing, which is what like the older theories, like from the days of Aristotle and stuff, like light is the reception of like the vision aspect of, what can be seen, that it literally imprints its form directly on my eye through light, or light is just the imprinting of its form on my eye, which don't quote me on that. I don't know my Aristotle very well. Just talking on my very little acquaintance with certain things superficially. But yeah, if you've ever met like some science nerd in like high school, like this was a common thing from like that kid who thought he was a fucking like 160 IQ motherfucker who was gonna solve the quantum physics of cold fusion. This is the kind of shit he would say. It's like, well, technically, we don't see anything. We just have the impinging of light, the particles, and we have the sensations of that, and even the sensations are technically not sensations. That jazz. Yeah, which I think is a really stupid kind of argument, but okay.
It comes off as almost Humean, the secondary and primary qualities. I'm not actually sure about his thoughts on if metaphysical knowledge is possible, or if he's taking the Humean approach of, oh, well, we don't directly perceive things.
No, he certainly has a metaphysics. The thing is that, like, instead of talking about matter, like, he's going to talk about experiences. Experiences is going to be, like,
right.
the basics thing. The primary secondary is just a lock thing, and it's a really, like, easy problem to show that it is a problem. So, why should we perceive secondary qualities? It seems an extremely unfortunate arrangement that we should perceive a lot of things that are not there. Yet this is what the theory of secondary qualities in fact comes to. There is now reigning in philosophy and in science an apathetic acquiescence in the conclusion that no coherent account can be given of nature as it is disclosed to us in sense awareness, without dragging in its relations to mind. The modern account of nature is not, as it should be, merely an account of what the mind knows of nature, but is also confused with an account of what nature does to the mind. The result has been disastrous both to science and to philosophy, but chiefly to philosophy. It has transformed the grand question of the relation between nature and mind into the petty form of the interaction between the human body and mind. Now, the whole thing of primary qualities is like, primary qualities are like shape, what other thing than shape, I think? Like, they're just kind of the basic physical things. So, like, you can understand that shape belongs to the thing, but something like hardness is just relative to my perceptions of it. Something like, light belongs to the thing, but something like color and vision belongs to me. So those are secondary qualities. So let's see. It has transformed the grand question of the relation between nature and mind into the petty form of the interaction between the human body and mind. So it's one of the places where mind-body dualism arises. So even if you're not a Descartesian substance dualist, the mind-body problem arises with the primary and secondary qualities thing. Berkeley's polemic against matter was based on this confusion introduced by the transmission theory of light. He advocated, rightly as I think, the abandonment of the doctrine of matter in its present form. He had, however, nothing to put in its place except a theory of the relation of finite minds to the divine mind. But we are endeavoring in these lectures to limit ourselves to nature itself and not to travel beyond entities which are disclosed in sense awareness. Percipience in itself is taken for granted. We consider indeed conditions for percipience, but only so far as those conditions are among the disclosures of perception. We leave to metaphysics the synthesis of the knower and the known. Some further explanation in defense of this position is necessary if the line of argument of these lectures is to be comprehensible. The immediate thesis for discussion is that any metaphysical interpretation is an illegitimate importation into the philosophy of natural science. By metaphysical interpretation, I mean any discussion of the how, beyond nature, and of the why, beyond nature, of thought and sense awareness. In the philosophy of science, we seek the general notions which apply to nature, namely, to what we are aware of in perception. It is the philosophy of the thing perceived, and it should not be confused with the metaphysics of reality, of which the scope embraces both perceiver and perceived. No perplexity concerning the object of knowledge can be solved by saying that there is a mind knowing it. Seems like what we just generally now call phenomenology, or at least on the continental side.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the ground taken is this: sense awareness is an awareness of something. What then is the general character of that something of which we are aware? We do not ask about the percipient or about the process, but about the perceived. I emphasize this point because discussions on the philosophy of science are usually extremely metaphysical, in my opinion, to the great detriment of the subject. I disagree, but
Yeah. Isn't philosophy all metaphysics? The philosophy of science, what are you going to discuss there? Empiricism? Or the discussion of empirical objects? It's not really philosophy, is it?
yeah, I mean, it is still metaphysics. Like, he has a metaphysics, but phenomenology pretends that it's not metaphysics, and I don't know why. It's a very odd way to think about metaphysics.
Yeah, you can't escape it. I mean, even in conceiving of concepts like cause and effect, these don't have phenomenological correlates. You know, they're purely conceptual. So, discussing the philosophy of science, you're going to have to be discussing metaphysics.
Yep. The recourse to metaphysics is like throwing a match into the powder magazine. It blows up the whole arena. This is exactly what scientific philosophers do when they are driven into a corner and convicted of incoherence. They at once drag in the mind and talk of entities in the mind or out of the mind, as the case may be. For natural philosophy, everything perceived is in nature. We may not pick and choose. For us, the red glow of the sunset should be as much part of nature as are the molecules and electric waves by which men of science would explain the phenomenon. It is for natural philosophy to analyze how these various elements of nature are connected. So, in making this demand, I conceive myself as adopting our immediate instinctive attitude towards perceptual knowledge, which is only abandoned under the influence of theory. We are instinctively willing to believe that by due attention, more can be found in nature than that which is observed at first sight. But we will not be content with less. What we ask from the philosophy of science is some account of the coherence of things perceptibly known. This means a refusal to countenance any theory of psychic additions to the object known in perception. For example, what is given in perception as the green grass. This is an object which we know as an ingredient in nature. The theory of psychic additions would treat the greenness as a psychic addition furnished by the perceiving mind and would leave to nature merely the molecules and the radiant energy which influence the mind towards that perception. My argument is that this dragging in of the mind as making additions of its own to the thing posited for knowledge by sense awareness is merely a way of shirking the problem of natural philosophy. That problem is to discuss the relations inter se of things known, abstracted from the bare fact that they are known. Natural philosophy should never ask what is in the mind and what is in nature. To do so is a confession that it has failed to express relations between things perceptibly known, namely, to express those natural relations whose expressions is natural philosophy. It may be that the task is too hard for us, that the relations are too complex and too various for our apprehension, or are too trivial to be worth the trouble of exposition. It is indeed true that we have gone but a very small way in the adequate formulation of such relations, but at least do not let us endeavor to conceal failure under the theory of the byplay of the perceiving mind. So I can see how like it is tempting to want to say that like a lot of the things that do come into perception are just there in nature. Like for example, Hegel, Goethe. I would say like Hegel more so than Goethe. Goethe probably didn't care too much about the metaphysics of it. But with Hegel says color is already there. It's not a thing of my perception. Color is already there in the world. But the phenomenology of color tells us otherwise. Uh, and you can already find this stuff in Goethe, where like you can have the eye sees things which are not there, physically speaking. Like if you do like the whole thing of like stare at something has a really high contrast, for like a good like 2 minutes or something, or like as about a minute, just like stare it intently, and then you can close your eyes and you're with your closed vision you will see the inverted colors. Well, the inverted colors can't belong to some kind of physical object receiving light out there. Your eyes are closed. So the way color is working is within you. You may want to say it's within your eyes or within your mind, but whatever way, it belongs to the subject. It's not a thing that being determined by some external stimuli. Likewise, there's the effect of like colored shadows, where a shadow is a shadow. It's just gray or black, whatever. It's just the absence of light. But the eye sees colored shadows because of the way that the interplay of how we process color. So, personally, I'm more like it's one of the only times you'll hear me praise Schopenhauer. I don't think I have any other praise for the guy. That on the theory of color, he had a good insight. It seems like Goethe's got like the subjective form of that theory, which also has a significant portion of it which is objective, concerning an aspect of it which Newton doesn't have. Whereas Newton has a purely like mechanical objective form of it, but it also doesn't have a full account of many of the things that Goethe found out about the physical interplay of light creating colors. Dark and light, light and dark. So, I'm not too sure about his claim right here. Oh, well, it's just natural out there. It's not so obvious to me.
Yeah, and to say that we shouldn't just assume that the mind is appending these things to perception is kind of weak. It's not really a strong argument not to do so. Just saying that it's lazy to do so.
If you don't have to, you don't have to.
Right.
So what I am essentially protesting against is the bifurcation of nature into two systems of reality, which, insofar as they are real in different senses. One reality would be the entities such as electrons, which are the study of speculative physics. This would be the reality which is there for knowledge, although on this theory it is never known. For what is known is the other sort of reality, which is the byplay of the mind. Thus there would be two natures. One is the conjecture and the other is the dream. Okay, so there we have the bifurcation of nature. It's between the subjective and the objective, primary, secondary. But, from the standpoint of Hegelianism, the distinction is there because the distinction is real. And, only, this would be the reality which there is for knowledge, although on this theory it is never known. Sure, on that theory. But that theory is garbage. And you don't have to have it. So if you think that, the meaning of perception is literally just the mechanical form of it, and that there is no intelligibility which structures that mechanical form, basically, he's arguing against these dualisms, which also, Kantianism is one form of it. We don't really see the apple, we just see the atoms, that bounced off the apple, but these atoms are actually just photons, and, they react with my eyes, and so what I see is photons, that bounced indirectly on the apple. What does the apple actually look like or feel like? So people who say, you don't actually touch anything because, technically speaking, the electrons, shells around atoms have a magnetic field in which the electrons don't even touch either. So the magnetic fields already, electromagnetic fields already push against each other. So, technically, you never touch. So, you touch your desk, you feel that. Well, you're not actually touching the desk. It's just, electric fields, electromagnetic fields, gliding on top of each other. Well, that's just fucking asinine now, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's just an interpretation of, in which you've decided that the physicality only belongs to the core of the atom, the nucleus. And somehow the electrons and the fields around it don't count, though they're not physical. So, things don't really touch. No, things do touch. It's only under an asinine interpretation that they don't. It's only under an asinine interpretation, that what the apple looks like is not actually what it looks like. That its shape is not actually its shape. So let's see. Conjecture the other stream. Another way of phrasing this theory which I am arguing against, is to bifurcate nature into two divisions, namely into the nature apprehended in awareness and the nature which is the cause of awareness. The nature which is the fact apprehended in awareness holds within it the greenness of the trees, the song of the birds, the warmth of the sun, the hardness of the chairs, and the feel of the velvet. The nature which is the cause of awareness is the conjectured system of molecules and electrons which so affects the mind as to produce the awareness of apparent nature. The meeting point of these two natures is the mind, the causal nature being influent and the apparent nature being effluent. So there are 4 questions which at once suggest themselves for discussion in connection with this bifurcation theory of nature. They concern 1, causality, 2, time, 3, space, and 4, delusions. These questions are not really separable. They merely constitute 4 distinct starting points from which to enter upon the discussion of the theory. Okay, I can see how the causality thing has to do with it. I don't know what time has to do with it, except in yet another way of interpreting this stuff in an asinine way that only analytics do. The space thing, I can kind of see how it is. Delusions, I can kind of see how that's a problem that arises. Causal nature is the influence on the mind, which is the cause of the effluence of apparent nature from the mind. This conception of causal nature is not to be confused with the distinct conception of one part of nature as being the cause of another part. For example, the burning of the fire and the passage of heat from it through the intervening space is the cause of the body, its nerves, and its brain functioning in certain ways. But this is not an action of nature on the mind. It is an interaction within nature. The causation involved in this interaction is causation in a different sense from the influence of the system of bodily interactions within nature on the alien mind, which thereupon perceives redness and warmth. So, one of these is just the purely physical account, without taking into account any consciousness or awareness of mind. Like mechanically, like there's some material bodies, impinging upon your body, cause, they're in high excited vibration, and then this, when he says heat, he just means that technical form of heat, the vibration, the energy, which strikes the body, if it's a certain vibration, it will impart its motion upon the body, blah, blah, blah. But only within the mind is this perceived as redness and warmth. The bifurcation theory is an attempt to exhibit natural science as an investigation of the cause of the fact of knowledge. Namely, it is an attempt to exhibit apparent nature as an influence from the mind because of causal nature. The whole notion is partly based on the implicit assumption that the mind can only know that which it has itself produced and retains in some sense within itself, though it requires an exterior reason both as originating and as determining the character of its activity. But in considering knowledge, we should wipe out all these spatial metaphors, such as within the mind and without the mind. Knowledge is ultimate. There can be no explanation of the why of knowledge. We can only describe the what of knowledge. Namely, we can analyze the content and its internal relations, but we cannot explain why there is knowledge. Thus, causal nature is a metaphysical chimera, though there is a need of a metaphysical scope transcends limitation to nature. The object of such a metaphysical science is not to explain knowledge, but exhibit in its utmost completeness our concept of reality. Well, I would say that's an explanation of knowledge, yeah. And I mean, it seems to me here he's using knowledge in like the far higher metaphysical, like ontological sense rather than an epistemic sense. Yeah, so there can be no explanation of the why of knowledge. We can all describe the what of knowledge. In a way, I can see how like that's agreeable. But for Hegel, like the concept works such that a what is a why. Just as an object is a subject is an object, and it's just looked at it from a different perspective of what is it that you're trying to do. So this causal nature is a metaphysical chimera, though there's a need of metaphysics whose scope transcends limitation to nature. The object of such a metaphysical science is not to explain knowledge, but to exhibit its most complete constant reality. Okay, I mean, it's intelligible enough. So at least his account of knowledge seems like this is good. It's not going to be epistemic in the way most people set up epistemology. However, we must admit that the causality theory of nature has its strong suit. The reason why the bifurcation of nature is always creeping back into the scientific philosophy is the extreme difficulty of exhibiting the perceived redness and warmth of the fire in one system of relations with the agitated molecules of carbon and oxygen, with the radiant energy from them, and with the various functionings of the material body. Unless we produce the all-embracing relations, we are faced with a bifurcated nature, namely warmth and redness on one side, and molecules and electrons and ether on the other side. Then the two factors are explained as being respectively the cause and the mind's reaction to the cause. So, does Hegel fall under a bifurcation of nature? Despite the fact that Hegel says, well, look, there's a distinction between nature and there's a distinction between mind. No. And I would say no in the sense that Hegel has a full account that he can make, in which we can go logically from one to the other. We know how we get from nature to the mind. We know how we can get from the mind to nature. There is no problem. So even though, in heat, redness and warmth is not necessarily there in the form of, that vibration, is stuff that still comes up necessarily related to it, from it, not only, and I mean, if you have like a conscious being, the way that the world appears and whatnot. What is this? Let me rephrase that. Okay. So the way I'm understanding this is that the problem is you can't, if you have this bifurcation, you have two independent systems and you don't know how to go from one to the other. They're parallel, and what are you supposed to do about that? And when you want to have a theory of nature, which by here I think he means a theory of everything, really. Obviously, you have to account like why do these things correlate? Why do they happen in one way in this system? Why do they happen in one way in the other system? How do these things actually relate to each other? What's the necessity? Under that bifurcation, you can have the problem that analytic philosophy has about other minds. You can have the problem that analytic philosophy has about what if somebody has a completely inverted sense of qualia from you? What if your blue is their red? Right. And the problem is that people who view that only as these things that are separate, but they're not separate. Just as like pleasure and pain, like somebody says, like, what if, like, pleasure felt like pain to somebody and pain felt like pleasure? Well, then to them, it would feel like pleasure. Pleasure would still like be pleasure, and pain would still be pain. It wouldn't really be a sense of inverted qualia. If somebody's red was my blue, but it was still a consistent thing, and it was consistent not only in one sense, but it was consistent across the board, then there would be no difference, functionally speaking. And what would it mean to say that then that they're experiencing blue and I'm experiencing red? So long as the same relation of redness that we talk about is what goes with heat, it's what goes with warmth, it's what goes with passion, it's what goes with, like when you see it, it causes, a sort of, not only it's a psychological warmth, for example, passionate, all these other things. It would have to be actually the exact same fucking thing. Like, it would make no sense to say, well, there's an inverted qualia problem. And did you get like what I'm saying, or like am I just rambling in a way?
No, I hear you. Yeah, the inverted qualia problem would mainly be a problem of labeling, but functionally, the process that's going on, it's the exact same. It wouldn't make a difference.
Yeah, and labeling is only a labeling between subjects. But if the same thing is the same thing from each perspective, there is no way to make a difference or distinction. It would not matter one single bit, and it could never be proven, and it could never be brought to question at all.
Yeah, but what else would the analytics write their papers about?
So again, like with Hegel, you don't have that. With Hegel, there is a connection between the vibration of atoms and the colors and the ways that you perceive colors psychologically. Everything is connected. So if I remember like the Whiteheadian guy from almost a decade ago, he claimed he thought that Hegel had a bifurcation of nature, and that never made any sense to me. So time and space would appear to provide these all-embracing relations which the advocates of the philosophy of the unity of nature require. The perceived redness of the fire and the warmth are definitely related in time and in space to the molecules of the fire and the molecules of the body. It is hardly more than a pardonable exaggeration to say that the determination of the meaning of nature reduces itself principally to the discussion of the character of time and the character of space. In succeeding lectures, I shall explain my own view of time and space. I shall endeavor to show that they are abstractions from more concrete elements of nature, namely from events. Hegel would concur. Hegel says there's no such thing as empty space, and there's no such thing as just like an empty line of time, or that being in time. That these are actually abstractions of the concrete relationships of matter. So the discussion of the details of the process of abstraction will exhibit time and space as interconnected, and will finally lead us to the sort of connections between their measurements which occur in the modern theory of electromagnetic relativity. But this is anticipating our subsequent line of development. At present, I wish to consider how the ordinary views of time and space help or fail to help in unifying our conception of nature. First, consider the absolute theories of time and space. We are to consider each, namely both in time and space, to be a separate and independent system of entities, each system known to us in itself and for itself concurrently with our knowledge of the events of nature. Time is the ordered succession of durationless instants, and these instants are known to us merely as the relata in the serial relation, which is a time ordering relation, and the time ordering relation is merely known to us as relating the instants. namely the relation and the instance are jointly known to us in our apprehension of time, each implying the other. Now, once you understand Hegel's theory of time, like and how like time works, God, all this stuff seems so stupid. Like, yes, this is how like most people think about time before they get a sense of how to think time temporally. Because notice this, like, okay, time is the ordered succession of the durationless instants. You know, like, these are points. Each slice of time itself has no time. And then time is the order of this. But nowhere in this do you understand why time moves at all. Nowhere in this do you understand the necessity of why a moment of time becomes another moment of time, and why the ordering of the sequence has an ordering at all, and why the ordering would matter to a temporalizing aspect of it, as a becoming, as a shifting, as a moving. So you're giving a frozen view of time, which cannot be the proper view of time at all. Like Hegel's the only guy who has like a way that you get the concept, and in the concept you're already moving. You can't help it. So this is the absolute theory of time. Frankly, I confess that it seems to me to be very unplausible. I cannot in my own knowledge find anything corresponding to the bare time of the absolute theory. Time is known to me as an abstraction from the passage of events. The fundamental fact which renders this abstraction possible is the passing of nature, its development, its creative advance, and combined with this fact is another characteristic of nature, namely the extensive relation between events. These two facts, namely the passage of events and the extension of events over each other, are, in my opinion, the qualities from which time and space originate as abstractions. But this is anticipating my own later speculations. Meanwhile, returning to the absolute theory, we are to suppose that time is known to us independently of any events in time. What happens in time occupies time. This relation of events to the time occupied, namely this relation of occupation, is a fundamental relation of nature to time. Thus, the theory requires that we are aware of two fundamental relations, the time-ordering relation between instants and the time-occupation relation between instants of time and states of nature which happen at those instants. Sure, makes sense. These are two considerations which lend powerful support to the reigning theory of absolute time. In the first place, time extends beyond nature. Our thoughts are in time. Accordingly, it seems implausible to derive time merely from relations between elements of nature, for in that case temporal relations could not relate thoughts. Thus, to use a metaphor, time would apparently have deeper roots in reality than has nature, for we can imagine thoughts related in time without any perception of nature. For example, we can imagine one of Milton's angels with thoughts succeeding each other in time, who does not happen to have noticed that the Almighty has created space and set therein a material universe. As a matter of fact, I think that Milton set space on the same absolute level as time, but that need not disturb the illustration. In the second place, it is difficult to derive the true serial character of time from the relative theory. Each instant is irrevocable. It can never recur by the very character of time. But if on the relative theory an instant of time is simply the state of nature at that time, and the time-ordering relation is simply the relation between such states, then the irrevocableness of time would seem to mean that an actual state of all nature can never return. I admit it seems unlikely that there should ever be such a recurrence down to the smallest particular, but extreme unlikeliness is not the point. Our ignorance is so abysmal that our judgments of likeness and unlikeness of future events hardly count. The real point is that the exact recurrence of a state of nature seems merely unlikely, while the recurrence of an instant of time violates our whole concept of time order. The instants of time which have passed are past and can never be again. Makes sense. Sorry, just rereading real quick. No, I missed something. Any alternative theory of time must reckon with these two considerations which are buttresses of the absolute theory, but I will not now continue their discussion. For Hegel, the absolute theory of time is just eternity, and the relative, and it's time itself, which is relative by its nature. And time is meaningless and has no order for Hegel, which is impressive as a thought. It is, on its immediacy, highly unintuitive, but once you understand what he means by space, it makes perfect sense why time has no intelligible order that matters at all. Just like in empty space, the point in space at which you're at is indifferent. It does not matter. It's like being on a sphere. Every point on a sphere is the center of the sphere on the surface. The absolute theory of space is analogous to the corresponding theory of time, but the reasons for its maintenance are weaker. Space, on this theory, is a system of extensionless points, which are the relata in space ordering relations, which can technically be combined into one relation. This relation does not arrange the points in one linear series analogously to the simple method of the time ordering relations, for instance. The essential logical characteristics of this relation from which all the properties of space spring are expressed by mathematicians in the axioms of geometry. From these axioms as framed by modern mathematicians, the whole science of geometry can be deduced by the strictest logical reasoning. The details of these axioms do not now concern us. By the way, something fascinating. At the time he was writing these in like the 1920s and 30s. The essence of geometry was what is now known as projective. Well, it was known back then already as projective geometry. And it is from projective geometry that you can derive every form of geometry there is. You can derive one-dimensional geometry, two-dimensional, all kinds. And there's a pre-Euclidean kind of geometry. I forget what. I learned this from Norman Wildberger's channel, Insights into Mathematics. If you have any interest in that, check it out. And this dominated. Like, if you did math, you had to do like a couple of years of like this geometry. So, probably 4 semesters now, the equivalents. And you learned like the whole gamut of how this worked, and like it's really powerful. And apparently, starting around the 60s, they stopped teaching this, and this is no longer the core of geometry classes if you ever go and take them. Unless you go out of your way to take projective geometry and like focus yourself on geometry as such, you don't learn it. So anyways, the points and the relations are jointly known to us in their apprehension of space, each implying the other. What happens in space occupies space. The relation of occupation is not usually stated for events, but for objects. For example, Pompey's statue would be said to occupy space, but not the event which was the assassination of Julius Caesar. In this, I think that ordinary usage is unfortunate, and I hold that the relations of events to space and to time are in all respects analogous. But here I am intruding my own opinions, which are to be discussed in subsequent lectures. Thus, the theory of absolute space requires that we are aware of 2 fundamental relations: the space ordering relations, which holds between points, and the space occupation relation between points of space and material objects. So, by he means events here, I'm starting to think like the closest thing that Hegel has as far as philosophy of nature goes is what Hegel calls place. Or place is a temporalized space or a spatialized time. This theory lies to 2 main supports of the corresponding theory of absolute time. In the first place, space does not extend beyond nature in the sense that time seems to do. Our thoughts do not seem to occupy space in quite the same intimate way in which they occupy time. For example, I have been thinking in a room, and to that extent my thoughts are in space, but it seems nonsense to ask how much volume of the room they occupied, whether it was a cubic foot or a cubic inch, whereas the same thoughts occupy a determinate duration of time, say from 11 to 12 on a certain date. Thus, whereas the relations of a relative theory of time are required to relate thoughts, it does not seem so obvious that the relations of a relative theory of space are required to relate them. The connection of thought which space seems to have with space seems to have a certain character of indirectness which appears to be lacking in the connection of thought with time. Again, in the irrevocableness of time, Again, the irrevocableness of time does not seem to have any parallel for space. Space, on the relative theory, is the outcome of certain relations between objects commonly said to be in space, and whenever there are the objects so related, there is the space. No difficulty seems to arise like that of the inconvenient instance of time, which might conceivably turn up again when we thought that we had done with them. The absolute theory of space is not now generally popular. The knowledge of bare space as a system of entities known to us in itself and for itself independently of our knowledge of the events of nature does not seem to correspond to anything in our experience. Space, like time, would appear to be an abstraction from events. According to my own theory, it only differentiates itself from time at a somewhat developed stage of the abstractive process. The more usual way of expressing the relational theory of space would be to consider space as an abstraction from the relations between material objects. Thus now we assume absolute time and absolute space. What bearing has this assumption on the concept of nature as bifurcated into causal nature and apparent nature? Undoubtedly, the separation between the two natures is now greatly mitigated. We can provide them with two systems of relations in common, for both natures can be presumed to occupy the same space and the same time. The theory now is this: causal events occupy certain periods of the absolute time and occupy certain positions of the absolute space. These events influence the mind, which thereupon perceives certain apparent events which occupy certain periods in the absolute time and occupy certain positions in the absolute space. And the periods and positions occupied by the apparent events bear a determinate relation to the periods and positions occupied by the causal events. Furthermore, definite causal events produce for the mind definite apparent events. Delusions are apparent events which appear in temporal periods and spatial positions without the interventions of these causal events, which are proper for influencing of the mind for the perception. The whole theory is perfectly logical. In these discussions, we cannot hope to drive an unsound theory to a logical contradiction. A reasoner, apart from mere slips, only involves himself in a contradiction when he is shying at a reductio ad absurdum. The substantial reason for rejecting a philosophical theory is the absurdum to which it reduces us. In the case of the philosophy of natural science, the absurdum can only be that our perceptual knowledge has not the character assigned to it by the theory. If our opponent affirms that this knowledge has that character, we can only, after making doubly sure that we understand each other, agree to differ. Accordingly, the first duty of an expositor in stating a theory in which he disbelieves is to exhibit it as logical. It is not there where his trouble lies. Hey, I don't know about that.
Why?
Sure. Because unless your goal is to destroy somebody from within, in which, like, you don't expose it because you think it's reasonable. You expose it according to what they are saying its rationality is. To the point at which you're going to get them to say, okay, this is what you're saying, right? And they're like, okay, yeah. And then you show them the problems. And in speculative philosophy, most problems are logical problems in which it is an issue of either an incomplete understanding, a misunderstanding, or a contradiction.
I agree.
So continuing. It is not there where his troubles lies. By the way, if you want to read along here, I'll link. Readings. PC. Oh, you already linked it. Okay.
Yeah, I did.
So let's see. Let me summarize the previously stated objections to this theory of nature. In the first place, it seeks for the cause of the knowledge of the thing known instead of seeking for the character of the thing known. Secondly, it assumes a knowledge of time in itself apart from the events related in time. Thirdly, it assumes a knowledge of space in itself apart from the events related in space. There are, in addition to these objections, other flaws in the theory. All right, I agree with the first ones. It assumes knowledge of time in itself apart from the events related in time. I agree with it too, probably not for the reasons he has, and I agree with the third one too, probably not for the reasons he has. Some light is thrown on the artificial status of causal nature in this theory by asking why causal nature is presumed to occupy time and space. This really raises the fundamental question as to what characteristics causal nature should have in common with apparent nature. Why, on this theory, should the cause which influences the mind to perception have any characteristics in common with the effluent apparent nature? In particular, why should it be in space? Why should it be in time? And more generally, what do we know about mind which would allow us to infer any particular characteristics of a cause which should influence the mind to particular effects? So why should the cause which influences the mind to perception have any characteristics in common with the effluent apparent nature? Any characteristics in common? Well, didn't he state earlier that's the problem, that it's not clear that there are any characteristics in common, which is why this, if it is logically consistent, either reduces to a nominalism or to a phenomenalism. In particular, why?
I'm not sure if he ever unified the actual bifurcation.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying this is a problem, but yeah, I don't remember him bringing up how they would claim to unify it. In particular, why should it be in space? Why should cause be spatial? Well, here they would probably ask because it is spatial, insofar as I have some kind of perception, I'm perceiving of something in space. What else are you going to say? Why should it be in time? Because it's temporal. I mean, those are easy illusions. Why should cause be only spatial or only temporal? Well, that's a different question. More generally, what do we know about mind which would allow us to infer any particular characteristics of a cause which should influence mind to particular effects? Right, once you make a sort of Kantian critical turn, it's wait, how am I accessing something that's non-mental? How am I accessing something that's spatial, temporal? That's not even a Kantian turn. That's just the Berkeleyan idealist, subjective idealist turn. The transcendence of time beyond nature gives some slight reason for presuming that causal nature should occupy time. For if the mind occupies periods of time, there would seem to be some vague reason for assuming that influencing causes occupy the same periods of time, or at least occupy periods which are strictly related to the mental periods. But as the mind does not occupy volumes of space, there seems to be no reason why causal nature should occupy any volumes of space. Thus, space would seem to be merely apparent in the same sense as apparent nature is merely apparent. Accordingly, if science is really investigating causes which operate on the mind, it would seem to be entirely on the wrong track in presuming that the causes which it is seeking to have... It would seem to be entirely on the wrong track in presuming that the causes which it is seeking for have spatial relations. Furthermore, there is nothing else in our knowledge analogous to these causes which influence the mind to perception. Accordingly, beyond the rashly presumed fact that they occupy time, there is really no ground by which we can determine any point of their character. They must remain forever unknown. Okay, this seems like an odd argument to me. So, because we have an intimate relationship between the order of our thoughts and the ordering of time, we have some kind of intuitive reason to think, okay, I think I think cause within time necessarily. I can't think it non-temporally. So therefore, cause being temporal makes sense. But if the mind does not occupy volumes of space, there seems to be no reason why causal nature should occupy any volumes of space. The space would seem to be merely apparent in the same sense as apparent nature is merely apparent. This does not quite make sense to me. Because just as I have an intuition of like the causal order of my feelings, I also do have a spatial intuition of the spatial order of my feelings. You know, like obviously not feelings as such, but like a relational order of feelings. Like I have embodied feelings. I can feel something on my right hand, something on my left hand. You know, and I know that unless, you know, like visually through the visual field or through the contact field, if I'm blind, you know, moving through space, until I get to a certain point in which I have the intuition, the feeling that I bump to something else, then I know like the cause of something, you know, stopping me is that physical spatial thing. Why would then I assume that there is no causal nature that is spatial? Like, I don't get why then I would assume, oh, well, space is an illusion. Well, what would that mean? Unless perhaps that's his point, that like that this is itself would be a nonsensical way to see it. That if there is some kind of reality, there's clearly some kind of intuitive reality to like spatial causation, then to that same extent, there's a reality, some kind of mental causation, and therefore, you know, suddenly the mind enters the natural through the linkage of causality.
Is there a spatial relation when it comes to thoughts?
No. Because like
I'm
he
not
says,
sure.
you know, like,
Is Go ahead.
because he gives the example, it says, well, you know, we can get abstract from all like spatial physicality and still make sense of the fact that, you know, we can think, and we would still think in order of time. Which is why he says, like, you know, it seems to be that time is transcendental to nature, but space is not. But I still don't understand what that has to do with a causal form that would be spatial and a causal form that would be temporal. Unless, of course, he would say that in my experience of like sensing, in my embodied sensing, even as, you know, in my visual field, or in my, like, you know, if I'm blind, just moving my hands or whatever, my contact with other spatial entities is still fundamentally only experienced, one, as a feeling, or, you know, he might just call this a thought. And this is an order of thought. You know, this is in a sequence of time. And therefore, you know, why would I talk about space? But that to me just seems like way overly like reductive. That would be just way too much of a collapse of distinctions that we clearly do have.
Yeah, I'm rereading the paragraph and the previous paragraphs. I don't really see the connection in that space doesn't play a factor. That it's an illusion or whatever, as opposed to time, which actually does have Hold on. Let me reread this. So, causal nature occupies time, but it doesn't occupy space, is what he's saying. But I don't see why not.
Yeah, it seems to be just like overly reductive to the subjective individual. That the only causality that I directly experience is the time ordering of my thoughts or experience. But as far as the causality out there, if it doesn't impinge on me, what is it a cause of? And insofar as it impinges on me at some time. And the impingement is just my assumption that there is something out there of a material substrate or whatever, mechanically moving. But if I just think about it, well, what if it's just all experience? What if humans are right? And these are just experiences, you know? It's all just phenomenal. So, you know, would I say that the experiences are impinging upon me in some kind of material spatial way? Well, no. How are they impinging upon me? Well, at least in this reductive model of either space, time, or subjective objective, it's going to be reducible to time. That's the only way that this makes sense to me. And then, like, that's just like a really, really abstract and poor model that, you know, you can't take seriously. Just because there's a lot more to, there's too much that's left unaccounted for. You know, it's just like you're going to just say, oh, it's just an illusion. Which, I mean, like, he's not saying this is his view, but he's laying out that this is some kind of, like, problem with the standard view. But unless the standard view is, like, highly reductive, I don't see how it falls into this problem. Specifically, this just seems to be, like, a very, like, peculiar problem through a very peculiar, like, reductionist.
I'm focusing on the last and second to last sentences in the paragraph. Accordingly, beyond the rationally presumed fact that they occupy time, there is really no ground by which we can determine any point of their character. They must remain forever unknown. I don't know. I just don't see the connections here.
Yeah, accordingly, if science is really investigating causes which operate on the mind, it would seem to be entirely on the wrong track in presuming that the causes which it is seeking for have spatial relations. Furthermore, if there's nothing else in our knowledge analogous to these causes which influence the mind to perception. Accordingly, beyond the rationally presumed fact that they occupy time, there's really no ground by which we can determine any point of their character. They must remain forever unknown. Yeah, it seems to me like this is only operating on the ground that, like, okay, the immediate intuition I have of causality, the most immediate experience of myself is the order of my own thinking in time. I can see that there is some causal order temporally, you know, the before and the after. But beyond that, if I'm not assuming this metaphysical distinction in the first place of matter, what need do I have for matter? Why would I have to then talk about some kind of spatial concern? Because I could just talk about it in temporally, and then I don't even have to speak about space or matter. I will just talk about the relations of the mind as such, which will be like impressions, you know, perceptions and whatnot. And perceptions of what? That they won't be perceptions of matter out there or space out there. So that's the only thing that I see that makes sense of what he's saying. Well, let's continue. Now, I assume as an axiom that science is not a fairy tale. It is not engaged in decking out unknowable entities with arbitrary and fantastic properties. What then is it that science is doing, granting that it is affecting something of importance? My answer is that it is determining the character of things known, namely the character of apparent nature. But we may drop the term apparent, for there is but one nature, namely the nature which is before us in perceptual knowledge. The characters which science discerns in nature are subtle characters, not obvious at first sight. They are relations of relations and characters of characters, but for all their subtlety they are stamped with a certain simplicity which makes their consideration essential in unraveling the complex relations between characters of more perceptive insistence. Okay, well, yeah, so I was on the right track. That whole previous argument is just to say, well, there seems to be no necessity at all for why we have to appeal to some kind of like spatial material component in the way that people normally think about it. In which they think about these as primary qualities and then the stuff unconscious as secondary qualities. And he says, well, given like the way of experience in the first place, why in the hell would we assume this duality to begin with? There's no need. Like, time, okay, you know, yeah, like time seems to be in some kind of irreducible element that we can't get rid of. But as far as the space stuff, why do I need to talk about space? Why do I need to talk about this nature out there, like, in which, you know, I'm some kind of alien and I need to somehow get to it? He's like, what I'm having are experiences. What I'm having is perceptions. Why the hell do I need to then talk about some other thing other than perceptions? Because that's all that I fucking have. So, you know, he's like, well, because even if we assume, okay, there's a world out there, like, and it's not perceptions, well, what I have is perceptions. It's the Kantian thing. What I have is phenomena. Out there are noumena. Well, then forget the noumena. I can't talk about them. Why am I even bothering?
Phenomenology.
I see.
Yep. And then at the point at which you get rid of, well, we can't talk about noumena, and there's no point in talking about noumena or positive noumena because we can't know about them anyway, so they are knowable. But they are knowable only because we've posited them there. If we just don't assume that they're there, there's nothing to be unknown. And so what is there is like what he says, just apparent nature. But then that's just nature. Because there's going to be nothing else to be had. What else is there to be like, to be talked about as knowledge other than like, well, what appears to us? And what appears to us has to be the reality which we are engaging with. So let's see. For there is but one nature, namely the nature which is before perception knowledge of science discerns, nature of subtle characters, blah, blah. So the fact that the bifurcation of nature into causal and apparent components does not express what we mean by our knowledge is brought before us when we realize our thoughts in any discussion of the causes of our perceptions. For example, the fire is burning and we see a red coal. This is explained in science by radiant energy from the coal entering our eyes. But in seeking for such an explanation, we are not asking what are the sorts of occurrences which are fitted to cause a mind to see red. The chain of causation is entirely different. The mind is cut out altogether. The real question is, when red is found in nature, what else is found there also? Namely, we are asking for an analysis of the accompaniments in nature of the discovery of red in nature. In a subsequent lecture, I shall expand this line of thought. I simply draw attention to it here in order to point out that the wave theory of light has not been adopted because waves are just the sort of things which ought to make a mind perceive colors. This is no part of the evidence which has ever been adduced for the wave theory, yet on the causal theory of perception, it is really the only relevant part. In other words, science is not discussing the causes of knowledge, but the coherence of knowledge. The understanding which is sought by science is an understanding of relations within nature. Yeah, sure, I agree. Yeah, that makes sense.
Generally.
So far I have discussed the bifurcation of nature in connection with the theories of absolute time and absolute space. My reason has been that the introduction of the relational theories only weakens the cause for bifurcation, and I wish to discuss this case on its strongest grounds. For instance, suppose we adopt the relational theory of space. Then the space in which apparent nature is set is the expression of certain relations between the apparent objects. It is a set of apparent relations between apparent relata. Apparent nature is the dream, and the apparent relations of space are the dream relations, and the space is the dream space. Similarly, the space in which causal nature is set is the expression of certain relations between the causal objects. It is the expression of certain facts about the causal activity which is going on behind the scenes. Accordingly, causal space belongs to a different order of reality to apparent space. Hence, there is no point-wise connection between the two, and it is meaningless to say that the molecules of the grass are in any place which has a determinate spatial relation to the place occupied by the grass which we see. This conclusion is very paradoxical and makes nonsense of all scientific phraseology. The case is even worse if we admit the relativity of time, for the same arguments apply and break up time into the dream time and causal time which belong to different orders of reality. I have, however, been discussing an extreme form of the bifurcation theory. It is, as I think, the most defensible form, but its very definiteness makes it the more evidently obnoxious to criticism. The intermediate form allows that the nature we are discussing is always a nature directly known, and so far it rejects the bifurcation theory. But it holds that there are psychic additions to nature as thus known, and that these additions are in no proper sense part of nature. For example, we perceive the red billiard ball at its proper time, in its proper place, with its proper motion, with its proper hardness, and with its proper inertia. But its redness and its warmth, the sound of the click as a cannon is made off it, are psychic additions, namely secondary qualities, which are only the mind's way of perceiving nature. This is not only the vaguely prevalent theory, but is, I believe, the historical form of the bifurcation theory insofar as it is derived from philosophy. I should call it the theory of psychic additions. This theory of psychic additions is a sound common sense theory which lays immense stress on the obvious reality of time, space, solidity, and inertia, but distrusts the minor artistic additions of color, warmth, and sound. The theory is the outcome of common sense in retreat. It arose at an epoch when the transmission theories of science were being elaborated. For example, color is the result of a transmission from the material object to the perceiver's eye, and what is thus transmitted is not color. Thus, color is not part of the reality of the material object. Similarly, for the same reason, sounds evaporate from nature. Also, warmth is due to the transfer of something which is not temperature. Thus, we are left with spatial-temporal positions and what I may term the pushiness of the body. This lands us to 18th and 19th century materialism, namely the belief that what is real in nature is matter in time and in space and with inertia. Evidently, a distinction in quality has been presupposed, separating off some perceptions due to touch from other perceptions. These touch perceptions are perceptions of the real inertia, whereas the other perceptions are psychic additions, which must be explained on the causal theory. This distinction is the product of an epoch in which physical science has got ahead of medical pathology and of physiology. Perceptions of push are just as much the outcome of transmission as are perceptions of color. When color is perceived, the nerves of the body are excited in one way and transmit their message towards the brain, and when push is perceived, the other nerves of the body are excited in another way and transmit their message towards the brain. The message of one set is not the conveyance of color, and the message of the other set is not the conveyance of push. But in one case, color is perceived, and in the other case, the push due to the object. If you snip certain nerves, there is an end to the perception of color. And if you snip certain other nerves, there is an end to the perception of push. It would appear, therefore, that any reasons which should remove color from the reality of nature should also operate to remove inertia. Thus, the attempted bifurcation of apparent nature into two parts, of which one part is both causal for its own appearance and for the appearance of the other part, which is purely apparent, fails owing to the failure to establish any fundamental distinction between our ways of knowing about the two parts of nature as thus partitioned. I am not denying that the feeling of muscular effort historically led to the formation of the concept of force, but this historical fact does not warrant us in assigning a superior reality in nature to material inertia over color or sound. So far as reality is concerned, all our sense perceptions are in the same boat and must be treated on the same principle. The evenness of treatment is exactly what this compromise theory fails to achieve. The bifurcation theory, however, dies hard. The reason is that there really is a difficulty to be faced in relating within the same system of entities the redness of the fire with the agitation of the molecules. In another lecture, I will give my own explanation of the origin of the difficulty and of its solution. Another favorite solution, the most attenuated form, which the bifurcation theory assumes, is to maintain that the molecules and ether of science are purely conceptual. Thus, there is but one nature, namely apparent nature, and atoms and ether are merely names for logical terms and conceptual formulae of calculation. But what is a formula of calculation? It is presumably a statement that something or other is true for natural occurrences. Take the simplest of all formulae, 2 and 2 make 4. This, so far as it applies to nature, asserts that if you take 2 natural entities, and then again 2 other natural entities. The combined class contains 4 natural entities. Such formulae, which are true for any entities, cannot result in the production of the concepts of atoms. Then again, there are formulae which assert that there are entities in nature with such and such special properties. Say, for example, with the properties of the atoms of hydrogen. Now, if there are no such entities, I fail to see how any statements about them can apply to nature. For example, the assertion that there is green cheese in the moon cannot be a premise in any deduction of scientific importance, unless indeed the presence of green cheese on the moon has been verified by experiment. The current answer to these objections is that, although atoms are merely conceptual, yet they are an interesting and picturesque way of saying something else which is true of nature. But surely if it is something else that you mean, for heaven's sake say it. Do away with this elaborate machinery of a conceptual nature which consists of assertions about things which don't exist in order to convey truths about things which do exist. I maintain the obvious position that scientific laws, if they are true, are statements about entities, which we obtain knowledge of as being in nature, and that if the entities to which the statements refer are not to be found in nature, the statements about them have no relevance to any purely natural occurrence. Thus the molecules and electrons of scientific theory are, so far as science has correctly formulated its laws, each of them factors to be found in nature. The electrons are only hypothetical insofar as we are not quite certain that the electron theory is true, but their hypothetical character does not arise from the essential nature of the theory in itself after its truth has been granted. Thus, at the end of this somewhat complex discussion, we return to the position which was affirmed at its beginning. The primary task of a philosophy of natural science is to elucidate the concept of nature, considered as one complex fact for knowledge, to exhibit the fundamental entities and the fundamental relations between entities, in terms of which all laws of nature have to be stated, and to secure that the entities and relations thus exhibited are adequate for the expression of all the relations between entities which occur in nature. The third requisite, namely that of adequacy, is the one over which all difficulty occurs. The ultimate data of science are commonly assumed to be time, space, material, qualities of material, and relations between material objects, but data as they occur in the scientific laws do not relate all the entities which present themselves in our perception of nature. For example, the wave theory of light is an excellent, well-established theory, but unfortunately it leaves out color as perceived. Thus, the perceived redness, or other color, has to be cut out of nature and made into the reaction of the mind under the impulse of the actual events of nature. In other words, this concept of the fundamental relations within nature is inadequate. Thus, we have to bend our energies to the enunciation of adequate concepts, but in so doing, are we not in fact endeavoring to solve a metaphysical problem? I do not think so. We are merely endeavoring to exhibit the type of relations which hold between the entities which we in fact perceived as in nature. We are not called on to make any pronouncements as to the psychological relation of subjects to objects or as to the status of either in the realm of reality. It is true that the issue of our endeavor may provide material which is relevant evidence for a discussion on that question. It can hardly fail to do so. But it is only evidence, and it is not itself the metaphysical discussion. In order to make clear the character of this further discussion which is out of our ken, I will set before you 2 quotations. One is from Schelling, and I extract the quotation from the work of the Russian philosopher Losky, which has recently been so excellently translated into English. In the philosophy of nature, I consider the subject-object called nature in its activity of self-constructing. In order to understand it, we must rise to an intellectual intuition of nature. The empiricist does not rise thereto, and for this reason in all his explanations it is always he himself that proves to be constructing nature. It is no wonder, then, that his construction and that which was to be constructed so seldom coincide. A Naturphilosoph raises nature to independence and makes it construct itself, and he never feels, therefore, the necessity of opposing nature as constructed, that is, as experience, to real nature, or of correcting the one by means of the other. Good question from Schelling. The other quotation is from a paper read by Dean of St. Paul's before the Aristotelian Society of May 1919. Dr. Inga's paper is titled Platonism and Human Immortality, and in it there occurs the following statement. To sum up, the Platonic doctrine of immortality rests on the independence of the spiritual world. The spiritual world is not a world of unrealized ideals over against a real world of unspiritual fact. It is, on the contrary, the real world, of which we have a true, though very incomplete knowledge, over against a world of common experience which, as a complete whole, is not real, since it is compacted out of miscellaneous data, not all on the same level, by the help of the imagination. There is no world corresponding to the world of our common experience. Nature makes abstractions for us, deciding what range of vibrations we are to see and hear, what things we are to notice and remember. Ooh. Objective abstractions, I like that. I've cited these statements because both of them deal with topics which, though they lie outside the range of our discussion, are always being confused with it. The reason is that they lie proximate to our field of thought and are topics which are of burning interest to the metaphysically minded. It is difficult for a philosopher to realize that anyone really is confining his discussion within the limits that I have set before you. The boundary is set up just where he is beginning to get excited. But I submit to you that among the necessary prolegomena for philosophy and for natural science is a thorough understanding of the types of entities and types of relations among those entities which are disclosed to us in our perceptions of nature.
Very interesting guy.
Yeah, good points. It's a very different kind of argument than what I'm used to against the epistemological problem in favor of ontology. Also, probably a unique argument, a little bit of a unique argument regarding Kantianism and subjectivism. They make sense, although we did have a little point in which it wasn't quite clear how he was arguing it, but it's good thinking. I'll give him that. It's not my preferred way of going about such things. I just ultimately prefer that Hegel can just show the problem of a concept as a whole.
You'll have to unlock your device first.
There's been something bothering me about this whole paper, and I think it's that he offloads cognition onto nature in a way that, Hegel doesn't do that. Hegel deals with, urges us to deal with thoughts through our own thinking, but Whitehead, I think he really wants to avoid metaphysics for some reason. But he's still doing it, which is weird.
Yeah. Okay, near the end thing about for example, the relationship of colors, vibration, all that stuff. Okay, having a quick thought on that regarding the stuff I said earlier. Given what he said and what he said the problem is, then I could say then someone like Goethe did answer this within nature itself, where these are not just ways in which we happen to perceive nature, like Goethe's whole thing about colors. Why do we have colors? Well, because we have the relationships of light and matter, where what is the word called? Opacity. The more opacity, light going through matter is, one kind of opacity. Matter, being covered by light is another kind of opacity. And, there's brightened light. Not brightened light. There's darkened light, which is red. And then there's light and darkness, which is blue. And that this relationship we can phenomenally perceive, but it is actually a relationship of physicality itself as well. And these don't just happen to correspond, they necessarily correspond. And not only do they happen to correspond in very peculiar way, it's just the colors are that way. No, it also happens to correspond with our own intuitive feelings and the way we ourselves emotionally react to colors and are moved by them. In such a way that the physicality of things also corresponds deeply to the structure of the emotionality of our subjective experience. Why? Think about it. How unbelievable is it that the excited, energetic state of average matter, which is fire, makes a fire, red hot, also invokes in us the sensation of, a heightened emotional state, passion. It's very odd. It's also very odd that, like, on the physical level of the appearance of things, like the darkening of light, what is it? Light into darkness in the sky, like the blue, happens to lead us to like feelings of coolness. And not only is it also corresponds with the color of ice, which is fucking bizarre. Like, that's one of the weirdest contradictions, actually. Like, that blue light is the most energetic, and yet it comes from the least energetic things on our planet. You have to look way out there at stars deep into space to see like blue stars and stuff. The things are burning so hot enough that you'll get blue flames.
Yeah, there's a big tension there. Like, there's the famous phrase, feeling blue. And in us, it's associated with depression or
sadness, the end of things.
The opposite,
the death, like things. And these things, the colors, the general vibrations, and the things that put off those colors correspond conceptually together. Like, their structures are very similar on different levels of ontology. So, like, well, why does blue happen to correspond to sadness? Because that is just what sadness looks like. And it seems that it's not just us. I mean, obviously, we can't say this unless you have, like, psychic powers, and you can look through other beings' eyes, which some people claim they do, and they say it looks the same. Adding here or there, certain ranges of colors that we might not have. But what is cold feels cold and looks cold, to all psychologically, like, conscious beings. So is it kind of nonsensical to say that, oh, well, actually physically, like, energetically low things, feel cold and look cold, and that this is just an aspect of the natural order? No, it doesn't it's not nonsensical at all, really. That makes me want to take back what I said about Schopenhauer. He's probably wrong. Anyways, yeah. This wasn't bad. I wonder if this is the one that he was talking about. Okay, because I remember this, the one that the Whiteheadian guy showed me long ago, seemed to be more about epistemology. I mean, this did have some aspect of epistemology core to it, but I remember it being specifically about, like, rationalism and empiricism.
What paper was just read?
Here's a bifurcation of nature, concept of nature, Whitehead.
Okay, concept of nature. He goes pretty into depth on people like Descartes, Locke. He talks about Kant as well in the introductory areas of Process and Reality, which is his opus, magnum opus, kind of the primary text. Yeah, that might be where. Yeah, because it's like he's got aims of education, religion in the making, process and reality, concept of nature, adventures of ideas is maybe the other candidate. And then there's a sixth one I'm familiar with. I used to be really into Whitehead.
Well, yeah, like, I don't think, like, we need to look at that, because, like, I can already see implicit in here, like, strongly what he's going to say, like, regarding empiricism and, like, rationalism, because he's basically just said it, but he said it, like, in terms of, like, physical examples. But yeah, not too bad. Still not my thing. I do have a book on comparing Whitehead and Hegel. I should probably get around to it. Whitehead feels like one of those guys is kind of like interesting. Like it's like Deleuze. I can admit like Deleuze is probably has some good shit, but given like his own technical jargon and the fact that I don't have these problems, it feels like a waste of time to me. But that's just me.
Well, Whitehead is definitely more interesting than average, I think, for a philosopher. Kind of like the philosophy of organism, and it's a monism of that is a dual, so to speak, and it's like an ontology of he kind of thinks of everything as a kind of organism or pseudo-organism. The basic units are drops of experience and things like that, and they're relational. They transmit datum to their neighbors, and prehension is these data as they are active and
You're
creative.
cutting out a lot.
Yeah, I thought it was just me.
An ideal pole. They're kind of Oh, good. No, it's the area of the house I'm in.
That's fine. But anyways,
yeah, no, it's an organic cosmology.
Yeah, you
And
you can do
expect
much
for
worse. That's for sure. Like as far as like if you're gonna spend your time with something that's analytically like styled to some extent, even though like he is like way out of. Well, he's not. He's kind of like persona non grata among analytics, despite the fact that he was one of the fathers of it. So yeah, like worth looking.
Yeah, he
into,
ends up kind of generating his own vocabulary to a certain extent. He uses a lot of antiquated terms, but I actually find his writing quite pleasant.
Yeah, this
he has
wasn't
interesting
bad.
point of view.
This was not like excruciating. But anyways, I'm recording and we are about an hour and a half. I don't think we have much else to say about like this particular thing, but for those of you listening, if you like this stuff, check out more Alfred North Whitehead. Not gonna stop you.